away.
I'm the center.
The center of attention.
First of all, look, I just want y'all to know if Luther or Pam calls you and say, I've got the best idea in the world, hold on to your pocket. Okay, because they were the two responsible for making me ultimately in charge of NAG for 30 months. And then they rolled me into in this chairmanship. So I finally got out of leadership hell. So thank you.
You're welcome to the entire audience, because what a great chairman he was of both.
Well, we appreciate you getting him involved, Pam. So he's glad to turn it over to General Carr. But we're excited to be here. Thank y'all. We're here to talk about the role of AGs during COVID. And we all know that it certainly affected everyone in this room. Our lives changed, the way we handle things, the business approach. This is to talk about how, as AGs, we've been able to work with everyone, the partnerships. But it certainly changed everything that happened in our daily lives. You think about, from our work perspective, the businesses, how they were affected, how they had to become innovative, change their models, the things that they did differently. Look at the children, the teaching aspects, how that affected everyone involved in that regard, whether it was your team members, your business colleagues, your children, that you're now having to step up and do something differently. You know, we had to look at how we maintain different milestones. You celebrated weddings differently, graduations. It was totally different in that regard. You look at the things that affected us from the legal perspective. Oh my goodness, we had to pivot and learn how to go to courts, how to handle all these depositions differently, how to be involved with our victims of crime, what we could do and step in a different capacity. And as AGs, we had to look at our role. We looked at our staff. How could we keep going? How could we not miss serving the people across our respective states? And that was key. You know, how do we get our folks up and working? What did we do to accommodate, which was completely different than what we'd been operating, just weeks before. So that's kind of what we're here to visit with you all today, about how we've been able to accommodate that. So I'm here with two of my distinguished colleagues, General Landry and General Schmidt, and we're glad to be here on this panel to talk a little bit about what's going on. I'm going to throw the first question out to General Schmidt. And we've talking about how we have acted as attorney generals, and so the question being, so what are the protections that you implemented during your first tenure there, part of COVID, those first few months? How have you been able to maintain, and what have you done that has provided protection even early on, and then through the consumer protection arena?
Yeah, so it's interesting because probably the last time many of us saw each other at a RAGA meeting was in early March. Now, some people were at Sea Island maybe, but in early March, I think that was like March 3rd. And, you start to hear some people were restricting travel. I was in D.C., and 2 weeks to the day, everything changed. Our offices were shut down. I think that was that week of St. Patrick's Day was the week, I think that was the week of the 14th or the 15th or something of March. Everything changed, and nobody was traveling. People were working remotely. Schools were out. I mean, everything changed. And so I remember being on a phone call that Monday morning, like a lot of people, with my senior team about what we were going to do. And we just said, hey, everybody's going to work remotely. Now, fortunately, in our office, Missouri, we've got about 400 people, about 200 lawyers in our office. We were pretty prepared for that. I mean, we had actually been trying as a recruitment tool, trying to, have people working remotely a little bit more. So we were prepared for it, but nothing could have prepared, I don't think, any of us, just like all of you, for what that looked like in your work environment and then your home environment. And those two things were merged immediately. And, so it was very different. So I think from from a personal perspective, there's all kinds of adjustments that need to be made. And I was that guy at Sam's Club loading up with 2 huge crates of, peanut butter and everything else. So we all kind of shared that human experience, which I think will, be defining long term. But from a professional perspective in the office, we went, you kind of go from immediately, a lot of what we do is we're playing offense, we're playing defense, there's a lot of things that we do. But one of the roles we also have as AGs is you're kind of the CEO for a law firm, right? So those administrative decisions came to the forefront, certainly a lot more often. And then as we kind of transitioned back through the summertime and into the fall, you start making decisions about, okay, what kind of safety protocols we're going to have, and what are, who needs to be back and who doesn't, all those kinds of things that are very administrative in nature. But, from what we also do in our positions, early on, we went from, and I don't think this is unique to Missouri, I'm sure a lot of my colleagues were doing the same thing. We went from kind of an educational campaign. We were doing a lot of PSAs. We were, and I would see General Landry's stuff. He had some slick PSAs out there, and I may or may not have copied a couple topics along the way. But we were educating folks, and then you kind of went into the price gouging, consumer protection stuff, because that was right in front of us. We also were trying to be forward-thinking on regulatory reform in that environment, too. We represent all the boards and commissions in Missouri, and there's a bunch of them. The client, the departments are our client agencies. So we viewed it as an opportunity to kind of slow down what they were doing, certainly on any enforcement actions, but then also suggest, hey, here are some things we can do to make it easier on nurses or telehealth. And I think what you're going to find now in Missouri is that we're not going back. Some of these regulations that were on the books from the 1970s, people don't need them anymore. They're irrelevant. And so I think there's some opportunities there. But as all of you in the private sector, it was constantly evolving for us. There was a lot of sort of administrative issues, but then we kind of took on different roles as educators, enforcement arms, watchdogs, and then hopefully bringing about some change as the way we do business within the state of Missouri and those agencies.
Eric, did you see a lot of price gouging, scamming that were?
We did, and we actually found some pretty unique partnerships that and other AGs did too, but I think we were the first ones to partner up with Amazon, or one of the first states, to partner up with Amazon and said, hey, look, we'll be the law enforcement arm. We're doing that anyway. If you guys see things on your end, let us know. We had some referrals, and there were some CIDs, and we worked with local law enforcement on some other issues. Facebook Marketplace. I mean, so a lot of that online marketplace that has changed so dramatically and now is being used way more than it was even 5 years ago. So we thought those partnerships were really important, and from the consumer protection side. And we had from the run of the mill. Early on, it was, toilet paper and all this stuff that we saw. But then the PPE, that was certainly something we saw a lot of price gouging on. And we were doing PSAs and enforcement actions, individuals, and then also, stores that were taking advantage of the situation too. But we tried to be cognizant of, supply chain issues and market demands and those things. But when we saw things that got completely out of whack, we did try to step in, and I don't think that was unique. But it was important because I think it also helped instill confidence in our state that, hey, there is going to be some, people are looking out for these, bad actors. And we also saw more scams. We saw the robocalls that were coming in were very different. It was, hey, you can get your check quicker. When Congress started issuing those dollars from the Treasury, we can help you get that money quicker. So we were warning people, hey, that's a scam. That's not real. No one can help you do that. So it was constantly evolving. But as we have a good team, and we stayed in constant communication with one another, but remotely for the most part.
Well, and having those partnerships is key, and that outreach to help all of our people across our respective states. And we definitely all saw a lot of bad actors, no question about it. But thank goodness, some of those have been put aside. So, and we'll continue to do that. Now, Jeff, from your perspective, when COVID hit, there were certainly a lot of this going on in all of our states, and we all worked very closely together. And I think we did help one another, sharing best practices, commercials, whatever we could do for our PSAs. But there seemed to be some overreach. And so, how did you step in from your perspective and, protect your citizens from, their keeping their constitutional rights upheld?
Well, first of all, we were, like Eric, our office over the last 4 years had really moved into a remote working environment under which we had the ability for our lawyers and even our paralegals to work remotely. And so it was great because the entire time that the pandemic hit, we ran 96% efficiency out of our office. We were one of the few agencies that did that. I got a couple of slides, and I want to talk about, exactly what we did. One of the things we heard at the very beginning, I take everybody back to March, was that one of the things that needed to happen was we needed to flatten the curve, right? And so you saw governors go in and institute executive orders under different emergency powers, and we recognized that these types of emergencies at the time, again, we take it back, we had a novel virus, we didn't know the infection rate, we didn't know the mortality rate, so everybody wanted to do and grant those governors whatever information they could in order to assess or to triage the safety of our states. And so what we did initially was we had our staff, we broke up into different parts, and we had them look at the things that our governor could do constitutionally. We had a couple of teams go through statutes. We poured through the statutes to find out what exactly he could and couldn't do, and we created this binder that I actually carried around with me that had all of the different things that either the executive could do or the legislative could do, and how there were checks and balances in it. And then we had another group, we had another team that was assigned to his executive orders. And so as he would issue an executive order, that team would look at the executive order and then overlay that from the research we had done to determine whether or not he had overstepped. And in the first 30 to 45 days, it really was interesting because there were a number of oversteps. But we didn't go out there immediately and take him on and say, hey, you're doing it wrong. And of course, we don't have, I don't think anyone out there believes that my governor and I have a great working relationship. But we didn't challenge him. But what I did do was I let our legislative leadership know that he was overstepping, and we said, well, look, maybe he needs to overstep here, but you can come back in a special session and you can just kind of allow him or codify some of the actions that he did, right? And because again, we're in the first 65, first 30 days, then the next 30 days. So now we had 60 days, and then we had 90 days, and then sometime in July, and I think that's what some of these slides you can see how the virus moved, and these are nationwide numbers and statistics that I'm going to put out there. How it was effective. Now, of course, you couldn't turn the media on because, again, I think they distorted the numbers. I think they really, really did. And it wasn't that the virus wasn't serious because, look, I know 2 people personally who contracted the virus and died. Both of them had a number of comorbidities and were in that 20% range. But then again, so then you look at this slide and you see how flat it's become since like January 20th seems to be kind of an interesting part, an interesting inflection along the timeline. Because you see, as you look at this from July 20th, from July 20th to now, that curve is flat. It hasn't changed much. Okay, now cases go up because testing has gone up, right? But overall hospitalization and mortality has not. It's been absolutely flat. And of course, the last slide that I put up is actually hospitalizations and showing how different areas of the states, different areas of the countries are experiencing different hospitalization rates at this time. And when you look at Louisiana, which is actually, for the first time, we're actually in a great spot. It's not normally where we are. But when I go back and I look at the data, I would tell you that the rate of infections and the number of people who contracted the disease, including myself and my wife, were extremely high in Louisiana early on. And then now, our hospital occupancy is down. And I think it's based on 2 factors. And those 2 factors are that, number one, we had a large amount of the population getting infected early on in Louisiana, whether it was because of Mardi Gras or not. And then number two, I mean, for God's sakes, our medical industry has done a remarkable job of identifying how to treat this virus and how to keep people from succumbing to the virus. I mean, think about it. Nobody talks about a ventilator. I mean, and that's not just that long ago. We're not talking about years. We're talking 90 days ago. Everyone said we didn't have enough ventilators in the country. And so to wrap that back to where we were and to what that overreach is that I absolutely believe that where we are now is that the government has completely overreached. Because again, we're not faced with the same virus. This is not a novel virus. It's not something new. It's not something that we don't know how to impact. We've got a vaccine on the market now. You know, Pfizer made the announcement this week. I mean, think about how far we've gone in such a short period of time. I mean, it's almost like patent running across Europe. I mean, it really is. It's unbelievable. But we have not been able to celebrate that. Instead, we've got governors continually wanting more and more lockdowns and mandates. And I mean, we look at what California is doing, and the data doesn't support that. And so I do think that there is a tremendous amount of overreach. I think at the beginning, the government and governors and executives should be granted large, should have an opportunity to exercise broad authority over their communities, to triage a situation based upon the data that they have. But over a period of time, there should be metrics. And that metric should be based upon statistics. And at that point, I think the overreach occurs.
Well, I think you're exactly right. And no question, our healthcare workers have been phenomenal. They have been able to get us that. We don't have the capacity needed for our beds. Like I said, ventilators are unheard of, new ways to treat, but staying out in front of it and understanding that we're not, you know, the overreach is now subsided and we're now, you know, on the ground floor helping everyone. We've seen a number of other things that have happened. Unfortunately, you know, we have to, as AGs, look at domestic violence, our child services, our child neglect, things like
Suicide
that.
rates.
Suicides, yeah, opioid is up.
Rates.
And so these are all the side effects of some of this where people have been locked down for so long and nobody's been there to be the caretakers to help them. And so unfortunately, those are some of the ancillary effects we've seen.
And I want to just add one thing on the overreach. I think what you're going to see, you know, our legislature meets from January through May in Missouri. And there is this sort of groundswell of angst about what you're talking about, Jeff. These initial orders that went up and there's no check. So you got an executive in whatever capacity, and I'm talking about a county or a county executive or even a mayor, and there's no review. And so I think what you're going to see is the legislature, at least in Missouri, and I'd be surprised if this doesn't happen in other places, to put into statute ways in which that power can be checked if a state of emergency is declared, or they use that broad power, which many times they have if there's a public health issue. And even these local county health boards that are elected, that are issuing whatever, you know, a stay-at-home order or a mask or whatever it is, that those are kind of low-profile races. Nobody maybe knows who those folks are, but they're issuing some orders that people agree with, don't agree with, but the people don't have a say. And I'm not suggesting that science doesn't play a role in these decisions. Of course it does. But the accountability, I think, is an important aspect of this. And I think you're going to see legislatures, so it may or may not be relevant to anybody out here or not, but I think you're going to see legislatures across the country re-examine what you do when you have something like this happen. Who gets to make those calls, for how long, criteria, all those sorts of things. It'll be interesting.
Well, it's going to be interesting, Lynn, if I might continue. Everyone can pay attention. Thursday, we're going to be in court. We have a hearing in a state court in Louisiana against the governor. Basically sued the legislature the House under our Emergency Powers Act. The statute allows one chamber, either the House or the Senate, by petition to revoke the governor's emergency powers. And the House in Louisiana did that through a petition. The governor turned around and sued him, and then said, in some odd way, I mean, only the left can do this so well, claims that the law is unconstitutional. I don't know that governors had the ability to pick and choose and say, well, this law is unconstitutional, so I'm not going to follow it. So I do think, and you saw Michigan Supreme Court basically check a governor, I think last week, on the very issue. So you're right. I agree with you, Eric. I think you're going to see court cases, and you're going to see legislation that is going to strengthen the revocation portion of those statutes under which governors are acting under delegated authority. I don't know, of course I don't know, I don't pretend to know all of the states and the emergency powers in those states, as whether those emergency powers are enshrined in the Constitution or whether they're done statutorily, but the police power normally is invested in the legislature, who then delegates it to the executive. And so there has to be a revocation portion of that statute, because that would be, you know, an unauthorized delegation of authority. And I think that those are the things that you're going to start to see played out. And it's sad, because I think that the reason we're starting to see it played out is because, again, there's been no metric set, there's been no benchmark set since the beginning, when we said, okay, we need to flatten the curve. I guess we forgot to ask, well, for how long, you know?
We like that accountability piece, and I think you're right. We're going to see a lot more legislation. People are going to want to have it check in what's going on, and I think that's no question about it. You know, our legislature this year passed protection law. I don't know if either of your states, if they were passed, and so it's a 2-year protection for our businesses, for our schools, our healthcare workers, and there's certainly some boundaries to it. It's a 2-year statute of limitation. You could still have committed certainly an egregious act, and you would be liable for that. But it did allow our businesses to open and have that protection level, and our schools to get back and feel comfortable about bringing those children back in, and certainly our healthcare workers. And I think that was great. I don't know if that occurred in either one of your states.
So actually right now, Missouri is in a special session to deal with some CARES Act funding and allocations and supplemental budget issues, and they're the legislature and the governor are kind of negotiating to extend that special session into a liability protection call and session. So I think it's going to happen, and it should happen. I know many of us have signed on to letters urging Congress to do the same, and it's just such an unusual set of circumstances that if people are trying to do the right thing, the reasonable criteria that's been out there, it could just be just a landslide of litigation if there aren't some protections out there.
Yeah, we did it early on too. We had in a regular session, because the pandemic took hold during Louisiana's regular session, which starts normally in March and runs through the beginning of June. And one of the things that we put in place, and we worked with a number of our legislators, was actually getting in place some liability protections. We did it both for businesses and for the government as well. And what brought it to my attention was, as soon as it happened, we started getting all of these cases from prisoners wanting to sue the state because allegedly they had contracted COVID. And so we put some great legislation in place. I think it's model legislation, really and truly. I was proud of our legislature for doing it. We coupled it, because we've got a governor that's a little trial lawyer friendly. What we did was we tied the business liability and the government liability together in the same bill, so that he couldn't, if he vetoed it, he'd have to veto the government's liability as well.
Well, and that's a key point too for all of us. We've had legislation that for protection, but we've also had these cases, be it the prison cases, the correction cases, that we've had to, battle and fight and try to, with all those prisoners bringing forth their issues. So that's been helpful as well, but they're ongoing battles for all of us, unfortunately.
Yeah,
I better call my office and make sure they're including that in the special session when we get done here.
Well,
You're right.
And I know our time's short, but I tell you, what I have found has driven most of the bad decisions. In schools, for instance, one of the biggest reasons schools are either closed or doing, hybrid schedules and whatnot, when you talk to principals and superintendents, lawyers. That's what they tell me. We're just worried about the liability. And I'm thinking to myself, really? It's gotten that bad in this country where we're making our decisions based upon the future of our kids on what lawyers are saying? And I think so I would urge you to, and urge states to adopt legislation protecting it.
Absolutely. It made a difference, getting our schools back, and our healthcare workers who are putting their lives on the line, our law enforcement out there, having to do this. So that was very key for us. So, yeah, we'll give you our copies of our legislation if that will help. I know this is just sort of an aside as a continuation. So, Eric, you want to tell us, you jumped out and had the first case against China, which I followed suit, but
That's right.
it was awesome.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so we filed in April, and essentially the claim is that, we could go through a long fact pattern. One of the things I'm proud of in the work that we did is we put together really a compendium of facts of what they were aware of and when they were aware of in our allegations in our federal complaint. So we filed a lawsuit against the People's Republic of China, the Chinese Communist Party. I'll mention why that's important in a second. And a number of actors, the virology lab and a number of their health systems there in China, because as early December, December 2nd, I believe, the Chinese government was well aware of human-to-human transmission. They were aware of it. And what you start to see as they roll into December was the beginning of kind of the cover-up and the silencing of whistleblowers. The doctor that actually blew the whistle, who passed away, that became known in late December. And systematically, these people started to disappear. And as the cases were exploding in China, they were allowing travel to the rest of the world, but not in China, which is telling. So the evidence, and if you go through the timeline and what they knew and when, it's pretty damning. And so we felt like, look, the cost to Missourians of billions and billions of dollars, not just in our state budget, but to the private sector, the loss of life, the human suffering, people not being able to attend funerals. You mentioned not being able to attend, people, not being able to attend funerals. And we felt like it was important to hold them accountable and lay the blame exactly where it belonged, which is at their feet. This is where it originated from. It could have been a very different scenario. If you want to be a serious world player, you need to let the World Health Organization know right away, and the world know what you're dealing with, so everyone else can prepare for it. So I think when you look back ultimately and figure out what went wrong as the world kind of pieces this together, I think these lawsuits are going to be really important. And I'll mention a couple things very briefly of how we get around the Federal Sovereign Immunities Act. There are exceptions to that, and a couple of them are, if you're objectively engaged in commercial activity, you do not get to avail yourself to the broad protections of being a foreign nation and immune from liability. So if you're running a virology lab, if you're running a hospital system, if you are hoarding PPE, you go from the world's largest net seller of PPE to a net hoarder of PPE immediately, because you know something's wrong in your country, you are no longer, protected by that Federal Sovereign Immunities Act. So we look forward to moving that forward. Service, as you might imagine, is a challenge. It's not like serving the drugstore down on Main Street. And we also, by the way, making the Chinese Communist Party gets us out of that state actor. So we feel good about it. We feel the claims are strong. We feel like we've got a good shot in the circuit that we're in. So we'll see how it plays out. But appreciate, and I know a lot of AGs across the country, Republican AGs, took a strong position on that, because I think one thing that President Trump has done, one of the many things, it has recalibrated how we view China. And so you're going to see a lot of things. I think supply chains moving back to the United States. There's a bigger and broader discussion about our relationship with China, and this lawsuit, I think, is a piece of that.
I do too. No question it's going to be beneficial to all of us, and certainly the Republican AGs have stepped up. And I think we've seen some new legislation now percolating through our United States Senate and Congress, and eventually that's going to continue to be impressive on how the landscape changes, just like you said, with China for us. So I guess the last question to both of you guys. I know we're probably bumped up against our time, but we know this is not going away as quite quickly as we'd like for it to do, but the flattening is very encouraging. And the real numbers, we got to continue to get out the true numbers. But what do you see as our continued role as AGs as we continue to battle and to, shepherd and provide service to our folks across our states?
Yeah, real quickly, I'd just say that, echo what I said earlier, is that I think we're going to see more litigation against governors. You're going to see more legislatures take action to strengthen their revocation portions of their emergency powers. And I think from a federal government standpoint, it's going to depend on which administration is sworn in January.
I agree with everything Jeff said. One thing that I mentioned, it's a little bit of a different take, is I think it actually brought to light our ability to affect some of the rulemaking processes and regulations that are on the books. We can take a leadership role in that as AGs to say, hey, this has given us an opportunity to look and see what these needless regulations on the books have done and inhibit, for example, telemedicine and telehealth. And I think we can take a leadership role in helping break down some of those barriers so people can get back to work and people can, live healthier lives more easily. So.
Well, thanks, Eric. Thanks, Jeff. I appreciate y'all's insight, and thank you for being a part of this panel today.
Thank you.
All right, thank you,
Thank you.
Lynn.